Companies like Audio-Technica and Beyerdynamic offer some very good options for both professionals and enthusiasts. You can find great headphones from them for under $200. In fact, the M40X and M50X have been staples among audiovisual prosumers for a long time. In the last few years, the Chinese company OneOdio has been trying to grab some of the market that Audio-Technica has within its clutches. Today, we're going to take a look at OneAudio's latest headphone, one which they clearly hope will entice you away from the name brands. This is the Monitor 80. It typically retails for $121, but currently is on sale for $100. OneAudio asked if I would review this headphone, and of course I said yes. Let's see what OneAudio has to offer us. OneAudio has several subcategories of headphones. They have the Professional series, the Hi-Fi series, the Pro series, and the Monitor series. The 80 obviously falls into the latter category. OneAudio says that this headphone was crafted for the audio enthusiast. They claim that this headphone is for professionals as well, including for mixing and monitoring. OneAudio says, quote, "Literally every note of the acoustic source can be perceived while mixing." Grand promise, this. The company says that the 80 will provide, quote, "solid bass and crystal clear mid-range, resulting in wide sound field and rich details." Unlike OneAudio's other headphones, the Monitor 80 is 250 ohms. The company encourages you to use an amp. Unfortunately, OneAudio does not provide meaningful information about the sound signature of this headphone. I could not find any frequency response graph online. Looking at the 80, I have a feeling that I have seen parts of this headphone elsewhere. I just can't put my finger on it. I suspect that OneAudio took some inspiration from Klipsch, Beyerdynamic, Audio-Technica, and Ultrasone. The 80 is open back. The mesh is metal. The headphone is mostly plastic, however. It feels no worse than the plastic found on some parts of the audeze LCD-1. The ear cups swivel in both directions to lay somewhat flat, and they also fold for storage. The 80 has two audio jacks. The left side is for the 3.5mm jack, and the right side has the 1/4" jack. This is a continuing design from OneAudio. Some of their other headphones have the same feature. The ear pads are velvet. They are large and spacious. They can be removed and replaced with any number of options in the market. The padding seems like standard foam but is soft. The headband has standard foam padding as well, covered with fake leather. The headphone comes with a very sturdy hardshell case. You get two sets of cables. The first has a 3.5mm jack on both ends. The second is coiled and has a 1/4" jack on one end and a 3.5mm jack at the other. Use that cable if you want maximum flexibility connecting to your source. As for comfort, I was rather surprised. The 80 sits on my head easily. It has clamping force that is similar to that of the HD6XX. The ear cups sit around my ears. The headband does cause some pressure, but nothing painful. I can wear the 80 for about 3 hours before needing a break. Overall, the build is fairly good. Of course, I would prefer more metal in the construction, but what we get is not flimsy. The accessories are pretty good, but to really drive the value argument home, it would have been nice for OneAudio to have included a set of spare ear pads. To test the Monitor 80, I paired it with various devices. This includes my Modi and Liquid Spark stack, the LH Labs Geek Pulse, the RME 80i2 DAC, EcoZerta ITM03, and Lotu PAW 6000. I used the stock accessories and listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. OneAudio says that the 80 has solid bass. My tests indicate that this headphone has a sub-bass roll-off and a fairly neutral mid-bass. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a rumble from the beginning which builds into a crescendo. The 80 presented this detail, but it had fast transients. The rumble was a little quieter than what I heard on the more neutral Olo S4X. When the crescendo hit, the 80 separated the organ from the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was a bit underemphasized, less obvious than on the S4X, but did not drown out the other elements. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. In Conquer by Overwork, there's a rolling marble sound at the beginning. This pans from right to left to center. The 80 presented this sound and some of the panning. There are multiple drums in this track, and the 80 rendered them all similarly. The various drums all had hard impact, similar to what I heard on the S4X. There was minimal melding from one drum strike to the next. I listened to several hip-hop songs, including Pure Water, New Patek, Reel It In, and Uproar. On each occasion, the 80 presented the sub-bass, but underemphasized it. The subwoofer always sounded like it was at the other end of a medium-sized room. The vocals were about 2 steps ahead of the instruments and retained their sparkle. The drums were louder than the sub-bass and appeared to be nearly the same as what I heard on the S4X. I listened to my Sicario playlist. I use these tracks to determine if there's any audible bass distortion. Traversing from low to high volumes, I could not hear any distortion. Overall, the Monitor 80 seems to have a sub-bass roll-off. Adding significantly greater gain makes a slight difference, but you would be better off with EQ application instead. Mid-bass seems to be close to neutral. OneOdio says that the mids are crystal clear. My tests indicate that the mids are forward and slightly sibilant. In Orla Gartland's Why Am I Like This, there is natural vocal grain and sibilance mixed into the track. The 80 presented and emphasized the sibilance. This was obvious when I compared the 80 against the more neutral Aventone planar. The 80's sibilance push was slightly greater than what I heard on the Allo S4X. However, the 80 sibilance was, without doubt, far less than what I heard on the HD560S. Orla's voice was 1 to 2 steps ahead of the instruments. There was audible separation among all elements. In Want You Back by Haim, the 80 again showed that it emphasized vocal sibilance. This was again marginally greater than what I heard on the Allo S4X. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary singer says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The 80 rendered this detail. There are 2 backup vocalists, one in either channel. The 80 initially presented all 3 vocalists clearly with their individual tonalities. When the instruments played at maximum, the backup vocalists remained separate, but I had to concentrate to notice this. The drums, bass, guitar, and piano all remained distinct. The drums never overwhelmed the other instruments. The vocals remained 1 to 2 steps ahead of the other elements. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the 80 presented the ukulele, drums, and bass. All instruments were separate and clear. The primary male vocalist was 1 to 2 steps ahead of the instruments. His vocal sibilance did not appear to be emphasized and sounded similar to what I heard on the Aventone planar. There's a backup vocalist whose voice is layered beneath the primaries. Most headphones cannot reveal this subtle detail. The 80 just barely allowed me to hear the backup vocalist. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths. The 80 presented this detail. Overall, the Monitor 80 seems to have forward mids. Female vocals are marginally sibilant. There's noticeable clarity in this region. OneOdio says nothing about the treble rendition. My test suggests that the upper treble is slightly emphasized. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the 80 presented the brass and horns clearly. Their nasally signatures were easily audible. However, the higher pitched notes seemed a bit emphasized louder than what I heard on the more neutral Aventone planar. The Allo S4X seemed to have a tiny bit less treble energy than the 80. The timpani was audible, but it did not drown out the other instruments. The 80 has some width and depth, but no verticality. In other words, some instruments seemed further out into the wings, some sounded like they were deeper into the room, but no sounds came from above or below. In Flight from the City, the 80 made the piano sound like it was 7 feet away. Its bassy notes were underemphasized, and each note had fast transients. The S4X made these same notes sound longer, with more bass. On the 80, the cello was as loud as the piano and sounded, for a lack of a better word, smooth. Both instruments remained separate and clear. I easily heard the pops and sizzles and electric buzzing effects. I also heard the creaking of wood on the pianist's bench and the shifting of the cello's weight. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the 80 rendered the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and the bass 1 step behind. All instruments were separate and distinct. The saxophone was the loudest instrument in the mix. Its higher pitched notes were slightly louder than what I heard on the Aventone planar and the Allo S4X. The cymbals are struck at different positions, which should result in varying tonalities. The 80 rendered these differences. Overall, the Monitor 80 appears to have fairly neutral treble until the upper treble. At that point, there's an upward departure. The treble does not sound harsh or piercing even at high volumes. OneOdio makes some vague statements about the Monitor 80's detail and clarity. My experience with this headphone was somewhat surprising. I have read many promises about how amazingly detailed a headphone is, only to discover that it is barely average. Here, the 80 does seem to have separation and clarity throughout the frequency range. Nothing sounds muddy or veiled, which then results in perceiving details more clearly. Creaking of wood, shifting of a cello's weight, sharp intakes of breaths, multiple vocalists, twangs of guitar strings, nasally signatures of brass and horns, these types of details are patently clear. For a more quantitative test, I use the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of steps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The Sennheiser HD800S presents 22 footsteps. The Focal Clear presents 18 footsteps. The Austrian Audio Hi-X65 presents 16 to 17 footsteps. The Austrian Audio Hi-X55 presents 16. The Austrian Audio Hi-X15 and X25BT present 13 to 14. The hifi Menzendara, Avantone Planar, Sifka Phoenix, and Beyerdynamic DT1990 each present 10 to 11. The Monolith M1070, M1570, Sifka Robin, and Ultrasone Pro 1480i all provide 8 to 9 footsteps. The audeze LCD2 Closed and LCD2 Classic each provide 7 to 8. The older M1060C provides 7 footsteps. The audeze LCD1 and HD6XX present 6 to 7. The Neumann NDH20 presents 5 to 6 footsteps. The Monitor 80 rendered 8 to 9 footsteps. On my scale of detail retrieval, the HD6XX and LCD1 are the average performers. Any headphone that provides more or less detail is judged accordingly. So the NDH20 would be considered below average and the hifi Menzendara as above average. Here, based on this scale, I think the 80 has above average detail retrieval. OneOdio says that the Monitor 80 has wide soundstage. Well, that depends on what you compare to. If your standard is Beats, then yeah, many headphones will seem to have wide soundstage. Here, the 80 does present wide soundstage, at least when compared to a litany of closed-back and even some open-back headphones. I have a soundstage scale. Once again, I use the HD6XX and LCD1 as my average performers. Headphones that have more or less soundstage than these two are judged accordingly. The audeze Mobius and all Beats headphones have claustrophobic soundstage. The NDH20 and ATH M60X have below average soundstage. The HD6XX and LCD1 have average soundstage. The Sifka Phoenix, Emotiva GR1, and Ultrasone Pro 1480i have average to maybe above average soundstage, depending on the particular recording. The hifi Menzendara, Avantone Planar, Austrian Audio Hi-X55 and X65, and the LCD2 Classic have above average soundstage. The hifi Mandiva has wide soundstage. The HD800S has super wide soundstage. In my opinion, the 80 has soundstage similar to the hifi Menzendara and Avantone Planar. In other words, it has above average soundstage. Looking at OneAudio's headphone lineup, I really do not know how they sonically group their products. Are some supposed to be bassy? Are some supposed to be neutral or balanced? I wish there was more clarity about that. With the title Monitor, you might assume that this headphone is supposed to be neutral. I'm not convinced that is the case. Instead, I think this headphone has a balanced sound that leans towards clarity and width. The sub-bass has a roll-off. I do not think it is quite as obvious as on planar headphones, but is consistent with many open-back headphones I have heard. Mid-bass seems to be close to neutral. There is minimal bass bleed into the mids. The mids are forward. Vocals always stand about 2 steps ahead of instruments. Mid-centric elements are separate, distinct, and clear. Female vocals with recorded sibilance will receive a slight emphasis of that sibilance. The treble is fairly neutral until the upper treble, where there is an upward deviation. This is neither harsh nor piercing, but it is noticeable. The 80 has above average detail and above average soundstage. Surprisingly, when OneOdio claims that this headphone is clear, I think they're correct. If you want bass, this is not the headphone for you. If you want neutrality, then you have to keep on looking. We need to conduct comparisons of products as often as possible. This is the only way to know how new gear performs in relation to what we already know. Here, we will compare the Monitor 80 to the Ultrasone Pro 1480i, the HD6XX, and the hifi Sundara. For these tests, I used the stock accessories. I plugged each headphone into a passive AB switch. That switch was connected to my Army ADI2 DAC. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. I tried to volume match. The 1480i has more neutral bass than the Monitor 80. The 1480i has greater sub-bass rendition, but the Monitor has a bit more clarity and separation in this region. Mid-bass impact seems to be similar. Transience is faster on the Monitor. Both headphones have forward mids. Both emphasize female vocal sibilance. However, it seemed that the Monitor had a hint more of that sibilance emphasis. Vocals stood apart from instruments a little bit more on the Monitor. Overall separation is a bit more clear on the Monitor. Both headphones emphasize treble differently. The Monitor has fairly neutral treble until the upper treble, where it increases. The 1480i has an elevation starting around the mid-treble region. Neither sounds harsh. Both headphones present similar kinds and amounts of details. The Monitor has slightly wider soundstage. The HD6XX and Monitor have a sub-bass roll-off, but the Monitor's is marginally more obvious. Mid-bass sounds similar. However, clarity and separation is more apparent on the Monitor. The Monitor has faster transients. The 6XX has greater bass bleed into the mids. The mids are different. The Monitor has forward mids, but the 6XX has more neutral mids. Vocals stand further apart and remain clearer on the Monitor. Separation of mid-centric elements is considerably more obvious on the Monitor. The 6XX does not emphasize sibilance, but the Monitor does. Treble is different as well. Both headphones have fairly neutral treble until the upper treble. The Monitor has a slight emphasis in that region. The 6XX has a slight roll-off. Clarity and separation is more obvious on the Monitor. The Monitor has greater detail retrieval and wider soundstage than the 6XX. The Sundara has marginally greater sub-bass roll-off compared to the Monitor. Mid-bass seems similar. Separation of sub-bass from mid-bass is also similar. Transience, however, is faster on the Sundara. The mids are closer to neutral on the Sundara. The Monitor has forward mids. Both headphones emphasize female vocal sibilance. However, the Monitor's rendition is marginally greater. Separation of vocals from instruments is more obvious on the Monitor. Clarity and separation of mid-centric instruments is, I think, similar. Treble is different. The Monitor has a marginal upper treble emphasis. The Sundara has fairly neutral treble throughout. Separation and clarity is, I think, a little bit more obvious on the Sundara here. The Sundara has greater detail retrieval, but similar soundstage as to the Monitor. Comparisons like these give us context. They help us determine if the fanboy devotion to some headphones is really deserved. As far as sound signature is concerned, the brand name or driver design do not have a monopoly. Indeed, you could find satisfaction from super cheap headphones just as you could with expensive options. Here, all four headphones sound different. They all fit differently. They all are constructed in their unique ways. One might be right for you, or you may hate all of them. I have tried at least 3 OneOdio headphones. I think their cheaper products are fine, but the design and fit need a lot of improvement there. I also know from experience that you can find true gems in the sub-$50 realm, as I did with the Sony MDR MA100. Is the Monitor 80 a gem? Look, I would not characterize it that way. It's a perfectly good headphone, and I see some improvements in build over the company's other offerings, but it is not the unique combination of super cheap price and unique sound that I'm talking about in order to call something a gem. On the other hand, the 80 is a well-built, good-fitting, comfortable, well-accessorized, balanced-sounding headphone that is well within many people's budget. For $100, you get something that is not typical in this price range: wide soundstage, clarity, and a balanced sound. While this headphone does not break new ground in any of these categories, the fact that there are combined in a headphone at this price is something of note. Is it value? Yes, I think it is. The Monitor 80 might not be the right headphone for you. I'm sure you can find enough logical reasons to look elsewhere. You may dislike the appearance, the fit, the construction, and not least of all, the sound signature. But this headphone is something you should keep on your list to consider.